Hey everyone, welcome back. We're building something peaceful in Minecraft today, while I tell you about a team bonding trip that turned into the messiest workplace scandal you can imagine. Sometimes the people who preach about trust and transparency, the loudest are the ones hiding the biggest secrets. Before we start, huge shout out to everyone who's been showing up, dropping comments, and supporting the channel. Seriously, thank you. Every like, comment, and share goes a long way and means way more than you might realize. This story starts with a mandatory corporate retreat and ends with careers in ruins, marriages destroyed, and one very awkward trust fall exercise. Buckle up, because this one gets messy fast. Now, let's dive in. I'll be honest, when Derek first announced this mandatory retreat, I groaned out loud. We all did. Another weekend sacrificed to the corporate gods of synergy and collaboration. He sent out this whole email about how we needed to step away from our devices, get back to nature, and rediscover what makes us work well together. Very inspirational, very buzzword heavy, the kind of thing that makes you wonder if middle management just copies and pastes from the same handbook. The cabin itself was actually pretty nice, I'll give him that. Right on the lake, surrounded by trees, the whole rustic getaway vibe. We arrived Friday evening and Derek immediately launched into icebreaker games. Two truths and a lie, desert island scenarios, all the classics that make you want to fake a family emergency and flee. But I played along because, job security and all that. Friday night was relatively painless. We had dinner, sat around a campfire, roasted marshmallows, and Derek gave this speech about how we're not just coworkers, we're a family. I tried not to visibly cringe. Amanda from accounting seemed really into it though, nodding along enthusiastically to everything Derek said. I didn't think much of it at the time. Amanda was always kind of a try-hard when it came to impressing management. Saturday was packed with activities. Morning yoga on the dock, a team scavenger hunt through the woods, trust falls in the afternoon, classic corporate retreat stuff. Derek was in his element, playing the role of inspirational leader, talking about vulnerability and authenticity. Meanwhile, I was just trying to get through it without twisting an ankle during the three-legged race. That night, everyone was exhausted. We'd been outside all day, forced to communicate and collaborate, and all those other verbs that sound great in theory, but are actually just exhausting in practice. Most people headed to bed early. I was sharing a room with two other coworkers, and they were both asleep by 10. I stayed up a bit later, scrolling through the limited cell service we had, before finally deciding to call it a night around 11:30. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. Our cabin had two bathrooms, but one was occupied and the other had a broken lock, so I decided to just go downstairs to the main bathroom near the kitchen. Half asleep, stumbling through the dark, I almost didn't notice the back door closing, but something about the movement caught my eye, and I glanced out the window. There was Derek, sneaking out of the cabin like a teenager past curfew, and right behind him, Amanda from accounting. Now, I'm not usually one to jump to conclusions. Maybe they couldn't sleep, maybe they were going for a walk, maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation for why two co-workers were sneaking out together at 2 in the morning during a work retreat. But something about the way they moved, the way Derek looked around before stepping outside, the way Amanda giggled quietly as they disappeared into the darkness, it just felt off. I should have gone back to bed. I should have minded my own business. But curiosity got the better of me, and before I really thought it through, I was pulling on my shoes and slipping out the back door after them. I kept my distance, following the sound of their voices and occasional laughter. They walked down a narrow path through the trees, and after about 5 minutes, I saw another cabin, smaller than ours, tucked away from the main property. A light flicked on inside, and through the window I had a perfect view. Derek pulled Amanda close, and they kissed. Not a friendly peck, not a drunken mistake, a real kiss, the kind that made it very clear this wasn't the first time. They moved deeper into the cabin, and I stood there in the dark woods, frozen, watching my married manager make out with someone from our team during a work retreat that was supposed to be about trust and transparency. The irony wasn't lost on me. I walked back to our cabin in a daze, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do with this information? Confront Derek? Tell someone? Pretend I never saw anything? This was my boss, the person who controlled my assignments, my reviews, my career trajectory at this company. Getting involved in his personal life seemed like a spectacularly bad idea. But then again, this wasn't just personal. This was happening on a work trip with a coworker, using company time and company resources to sneak around behind his wife's back. That felt different somehow. That felt like something that affected all of us. I barely slept the rest of the night, running through scenarios in my head. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself to stay out of it. It wasn't my circus, wasn't my monkeys, as my mum would say. Then came the breaking point. Sunday morning, we were all gathering for breakfast when a car pulled up outside. Everyone looked confused because we weren't expecting anyone. Derek's face went completely pale as his wife stepped out of the vehicle, holding a small overnight bag and wearing a huge smile. "Surprise," she called out, walking toward the cabin. "I couldn't stay away all weekend. I missed you too much." The look on Derek's face was priceless. Pure panic, barely concealed behind a forced smile. He rushed over to her, and I watched as he fumbled through an explanation about how this was supposed to be a solo work thing, how she shouldn't have come, how unprofessional it would look. But she just laughed and said she'd already cleared it with his boss, that everyone understood wanting to see your spouse, that she'd only stay for the day. Derek had no choice but to go along with it. And watching him squirm, watching Amanda avoid eye contact with everyone, watching this whole charade unfold, I realized I had a decision to make. His wife was lovely, genuinely kind, chatting with all of us, asking about our families, complimenting the cabin. She had no idea, none. And here was Derek, playing the devoted husband, introducing her to everyone, including Amanda, acting like everything was perfectly normal. We moved into the final activity of the retreat, the big trust circle that Derek had been hyping up all weekend. Everyone sat in a circle, and we were supposed to share the most important thing we'd learned about trust during our time together. People gave generic answers. I learned we're stronger together. I learned vulnerability is strength, the usual corporate speak. Then Derek's wife, who'd been watching from the side, asked if she could participate. Derek looked uncomfortable but couldn't really say no without looking like a jerk. She sat down in the circle and said she wanted to hear from everyone, wanted to know what trust really meant to each of us. If you've made it this far into the chaos, you're as addicted to Reddit drama as I am. Make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because trust me, we're just getting started. Now where was I? Oh right, standing in a circle of coworkers, about to drop a truth bomb that would detonate my manager's entire life. When it got to me, I looked directly at Derek. His eyes were practically begging me to keep quiet. Amanda looked like she might throw up. And Derek's wife sat there, smiling, waiting to hear what wisdom I'd gained from this weekend of team building. "I learned some people use trust as a weapon," I said. My voice was steady, calm. They talk about it constantly, make it the foundation of everything they do, but really they're just using it as cover for their own agenda. The biggest betrayals come from the people who preach about honesty the loudest. The circle went dead silent, Derek's face drained of all color. His wife tilted her head, processing what I'd said, a small furrow appearing between her eyebrows. A few of my co-workers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension but not quite understanding where it came from. Derek tried to move on quickly, thanking everyone for sharing, but his wife wasn't done. She asked him if something was wrong, if there was something going on at work that was bothering people. He stammered through a non-answer, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. The retreat wrapped up shortly after that. Everyone packed their bags, and I watched as Derek's wife pulled him aside for a private conversation. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw her face shift from confused to suspicious to angry in the span of about 3 minutes. That afternoon, she asked to see his phone. I wasn't there for that part, but I heard about it later from one of my co-workers who witnessed the explosion. Apparently, Derek had been texting Amanda all weekend, even with his wife there. Messages about when they could sneak away again, about how close they'd come to getting caught, about how the retreat had been the perfect cover. His wife found everything, not just the texts from this weekend, but months' worth of messages, evidence of a full-blown affair that had been going on right under everyone's noses. She left immediately, taking the car and leaving Derek to find his own ride home. By Monday morning, Derek was called into HR. By Monday afternoon, he was fired. Not just for the affair, though, that was bad enough, but for creating a hostile work environment, for misusing company resources, for the inappropriate relationship with a subordinate, and for lying on his expense reports about the cabin. Turns out he'd booked that second cabin on the company card specifically so he and Amanda would have a private place to hook up. Amanda was transferred to a different department, far away from our team. And me? I got called into the director's office and offered Derek's position as interim manager. Apparently, someone had told HR that I was the one who'd maintained professionalism throughout the whole mess, that I'd shown real leadership during a difficult situation. I accepted the promotion, and I made it very clear to my new team that our retreats would be focused on actual work, not whatever disaster Derek had been orchestrating. You almost have to admire the audacity of using a team bonding retreat to carry on an affair, then having the nerve to lecture everyone about trust and transparency. They really do write their own endings without realizing it. But workplace betrayal isn't always about romance. Sometimes it cuts even deeper when someone weaponizes your pain for their own gain. Opening up to someone about your deepest trauma is one of the hardest things you can do. It requires trust, vulnerability, and the belief that the person you're confiding in will treat your pain with the respect it deserves. So when I finally told Jake about my childhood sexual abuse, after 6 months of dating, it felt like I was handing him a piece of my soul. I'd never told a partner before. The words physically hurt coming out of my mouth. I cried through most of it, and Jake held me, told me how strong I was, how much he admired my courage, how safe I was with him. I actually believed him. For 3 weeks after that conversation, things felt different between us, closer somehow. I thought we'd crossed some threshold into real intimacy. I thought sharing that part of myself had brought us together in a way that mattered. Looking back, I realized I was so focused on my own vulnerability that I completely missed what was actually happening. I'd given Jake something valuable, something he could use, and he absolutely ran with it. The party was at his friend Marcus's apartment, one of those typical weekend gatherings where everyone's drinking cheap wine and pretending to enjoy overplayed playlist music. I knew most of the people there, at least casually, but there were a few new faces. One of them was Melissa, someone Marcus knew from grad school. She was smart, funny, exactly the type of person who'd be interesting to talk to at a party. I was in the living room talking to a couple of Marcus's roommates when I realized I hadn't seen Jake in a while. I went looking for him, mostly just to check in, and heard his voice coming from the kitchen. He was talking to someone, and his tone had that particular quality guys get when they're trying to seem deep and sensitive. You know the one. I almost turned around and left him to it, but then I heard him say my name, and something made me stop. He was telling Melissa about me. Specifically, he was telling her about my trauma, in detail, the exact details I'd shared with him in private, through tears, in what I thought was a sacred moment between two people who cared about each other. He was recounting it like it was a story he'd read somewhere, like it was content to be consumed and discussed, like it belonged to him. I stood there in the hallway, frozen, listening to him describe the worst thing that ever happened to me, to a woman he'd just met. Melissa made sympathetic noises, said something about how terrible that must have been for me, how hard it must be for him to support me through it. And that's when Jake said it. That's when he actually said, I try to be her hero. Her hero. Like my trauma was a damsel in distress situation, and he was the knight swooping in to save the day. Like my pain existed to give him an opportunity to demonstrate what a good, sensitive, supportive boyfriend he was. I genuinely thought this couldn't get worse. I was wrong. Because Melissa kept going, asking him questions about how he helps me cope, what kind of support I need, whether therapy is working, and Jake answered every single question. He talked about things I'd never even told him, things he'd apparently extrapolated or assumed, or just made up to make the story more compelling. He positioned himself as this incredibly empathetic partner who was so evolved and aware, who understood trauma so deeply. He was performing emotional depth using my actual suffering as his script. I don't remember making the decision to walk into that kitchen. One second I was in the hallway, the next I was standing in the doorway, and both of them were looking at me. Melissa smiled, completely unaware. Jake's face did something complicated, a mix of surprise and guilt and fear all happening at once. I looked directly at him and said, very calmly, could you repeat what you just said? His mouth opened and closed like a fish. He knew exactly what I'd heard. He knew exactly how badly he'd screwed up. But he still tried to play it off, tried to stammer something about just having a conversation, just talking about how strong I am. I turned to Melissa. He's not my hero. He's a tourist in my trauma. Then I looked back at Jake. We're done. I walked out of that party and drove straight home. My hands were shaking so badly, I probably shouldn't have been driving, but I needed to get away from him, from that situation, from the realization that someone I trusted with my most painful secret had treated it like currency. My phone started blowing up before I even got home. Text after text, call after call, all from Jake. I didn't answer any of them. When I finally got to my apartment, I sat on my couch and read through his messages. They were all variations on the same theme. He was sorry. He didn't mean it the way it sounded. He was just trying to help raise awareness about sexual abuse. He thought talking about it openly would help destigmatize it. He was just so proud of how strong I was and wanted other people to understand what I'd been through. Every excuse made it worse. Every justification dug the hole deeper. He genuinely seemed to think he'd done something noble, something that benefited me somehow, like I should be grateful he was out there telling my story without my permission, using my pain to make himself look good at parties. The thing is, raising awareness is great, destigmatizing trauma is important, but that's my choice to make, my story to tell, my decision when and how and to whom I share the worst thing that ever happened to me. He stole that from me. He took something I gave him in confidence and turned it into a party trick, a way to seem deep and sensitive to women he wanted to impress. And here's where it gets absurd. After hours of apology texts, after voicemails where he cried and said he loved me and couldn't lose me, he sent one more message. This one said he understood if I needed space, but he hoped I'd eventually see that he was just trying to be supportive in the only way he knew how, and that his intentions were good even if his execution was flawed. His intentions were good, like that mattered, like good intentions somehow cancelled out the fact that he'd violated my trust in one of the worst ways possible. I replied with one text, just one. My story isn't your accessory. Then I blocked him. Blocked his number, blocked him on every social media platform, blocked his email. I didn't want to hear another word from him. I didn't want another excuse, another justification, another attempt to reframe his betrayal as somehow well-intentioned. I called my therapist the next day and scheduled an emergency session. Because here's the thing about trauma, it compounds. The original wound is bad enough, but then when someone you trust uses that wound against you, it opens up a whole new layer of damage. I had to process not just what Jake had done, but what it meant that he'd done it. The fact that I'd been vulnerable with him and he'd seen that vulnerability as an asset he could leverage. My therapist helped me understand that Jake's behavior wasn't about me at all. It was about him, about his need to be seen as sensitive and deep and emotionally evolved. My trauma was just a tool he used to craft that image, and while that didn't make it hurt less, it did help me see that this betrayal was a reflection of his character, not my judgment. I found out later through mutual friends that Melissa actually confronted Jake after I left the party. She'd figured out pretty quickly what had happened and told him he was out of line. Apparently he tried to defend himself, said I was overreacting, that I'd misunderstood the situation. Melissa shut him down hard, told him exactly how inappropriate his behavior was, and left the party herself. I ended up reaching out to her a few weeks later to thank her. We got coffee, and she apologized for engaging with him in the first place, even though she had no way of knowing what was happening. We're actually friends now, which is one of the few good things that came out of that disaster. Jake tried to reach out a few more times through mutual friends, asking them to tell me he was sorry, asking if there was any way we could talk. I told every single one of them the same thing. No, there was nothing to talk about. What he did wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a fundamental betrayal of trust, and there's no coming back from that. The whole experience taught me something important about vulnerability. It's powerful, but it's also dangerous. When you open up to someone, you're giving them ammunition, and you have to trust they won't use it against you. Jake proved he couldn't be trusted with that responsibility, and I'm grateful I found out after 6 months instead of 6 years. Some people really do see your pain as their opportunity, and they'll perform empathy while exploiting your trauma for social points. They basically wrote their own ending the moment they decided your story was theirs to tell. Speaking of people who twist reality for their benefit, sometimes lies aren't about big secrets. They're about creating entirely fake personas. Marcus and I had been together for 8 months, And honestly, things were going pretty well. Or at least I thought they were. We had that comfortable rhythm where you're past the awkward early stages, but not quite at the move in together phase. He traveled a lot for work, which was fine. I had my own life, my own friends, my own routine. The distance actually felt healthy, like we both had space to breathe. Then one Saturday morning, I was helping him pack for another one of his work trips when I found it. A gold wedding band, just sitting there in the side pocket of his gym bag, like it was the most normal thing in the world. My stomach dropped. I stood there holding this ring, turning it over in my fingers, trying to come up with literally any innocent explanation. Maybe it was his dad's, maybe he was holding it for a friend, maybe it was a prop for something, but deep down, I already knew. You don't just casually carry around a wedding ring unless it means something. Marcus walked into the bedroom and saw me holding it. And here's the thing that still gets me. He didn't even flinch. No panic, no fumbling for words, no deer in headlights moment. He just looked at me and said, "Oh yeah, I've been meaning to mention that." "I'm sorry, what?" He sat down on the bed, completely calm, and explained that his company had this policy. For a major client pitch they were working on, a family values-focused corporation, they needed all the account managers to appear married, stable, settled, the kind of people who coached Little League and went to church on Sundays, so they were required to wear wedding rings during client meetings and any related events. I just stared at him. That is the most insane thing I've ever heard. He shrugged. "I know it sounds weird, but it's a multi-million-dollar account. They're very particular about image. It's all temporary, just for optics during this pitch cycle." It sounded completely ridiculous, but it also sounded oddly specific, like, who makes up a lie that detailed? I wanted to believe him. I really did, because the alternative was that the person I'd been falling for was living an entire secret life. "Show me," I said. "What? The pitch deck? The emails? Show me proof that this is actually a work thing." To his credit, or maybe to his detriment, he pulled out his laptop immediately. He showed me emails from his boss discussing the client, mentioning the importance of presenting the right image. There was a corporate memo about dress code expectations. Nothing explicitly said wear a wedding ring or pretend to be married, but it was all couched in language about professionalism and family values and representing the company's culture. I read through everything twice. It seemed legitimate. The emails had company signatures, proper formatting, the works, but something still felt wrong. Maybe it was the way he'd been so calm when I found the ring. Maybe it was the fact that in 8 months, he'd never mentioned this policy before. Or maybe it was just my gut screaming that something didn't add up. I told him I needed time to think. He kissed me on the forehead and left for his trip, ring in his pocket, like everything was fine. The second he was gone, I went full detective mode. I couldn't just let this go. If he was telling the truth, great. I'd feel terrible for doubting him and we'd move on. But if he was lying, I needed to know. I started by Googling his company's client list, trying to figure out which account he was talking about. Found a few possibilities, all big corporations, all with traditional images. That part checked out. Then I looked up his boss on LinkedIn. Seemed legit. Normal career trajectory, connections that made sense, posts about company wins. But here's where it gets absurd. I created a fake LinkedIn profile, made myself a recruiter at a staffing firm, used stock photos, wrote a professional-sounding bio. Then I messaged his boss with a generic outreach message. Something about hearing great things about the company culture and wondering if they had any openings for senior account managers. His boss responded within a day. Very friendly, very professional, said they weren't hiring at the moment but would keep my information on file. I replied thanking him and then, as casually as possible, mentioned that I'd heard they had some unique policies around client presentations and was curious how that worked in practice. He had no idea what I was talking about. I pushed a little further, mentioning the family values thing, the image requirements. He wrote back saying they absolutely did not have any policy requiring employees to appear married or wear wedding rings. That would actually be illegal. He added, "We hire and promote based on merit, not marital status." My hands were shaking as I read his response. The ring was real. Marcus was married, actually married. I sat there for a long time, just processing. All those work trips, the weekends he was unavailable. The times his phone would be off for hours because he was in meetings. It was all a lie. He had a whole other life I knew nothing about. I could have confronted him immediately, could have called him, screamed at him, demanded answers, but I wanted proof, real, undeniable proof. So I waited until he got back from his trip. When Marcus walked through my door, Sunday night, I was ready. I'd printed out the LinkedIn messages, screenshots of his boss's responses, everything. I laid them out on my coffee table like evidence at a crime scene. "Sit down," I said. He looked at the papers and his face finally showed panic. That calm exterior cracked just enough for me to see the truth underneath. "I know you're married," I said. "Your company has no ring policy. Your boss confirmed it. So either you start telling me the truth right now, or you leave and never contact me again." This is where patience finally snapped. Marcus tried to backtrack. He said, "Okay, yes, technically he was married, but it wasn't like that. He and his wife were basically roommates. They'd grown apart years ago but stayed together for financial reasons. They were separated in everything but paperwork. He'd been meaning to tell me but didn't know how." I cut him off. "Where does your wife live?" He hesitated. "Connecticut. And where do you go on your work trips?" The silence was deafening. "Connecticut," he finally admitted. "But I'm staying with a friend. We're not even in the same house most of the time. So those weekend work trips were actually you going home to your wife." He started explaining, justifying, trying to make it sound less awful than it was. But I was done listening. I told him to leave. He tried to argue, tried to convince me that his feelings for me were real, even if the situation was complicated. I literally pointed at the door. After he left, I sat there feeling hollow. 8 months. 8 months of my life spent with someone who'd been lying the entire time. But the hollowness slowly transformed into something else. Anger. Not the explosive kind, but the cold, calculated kind that demands justice. I found his wife on Facebook. Her profile was public. Photos of her and Marcus at family events, vacation pictures, anniversary posts from years past. She had no idea I existed. I sent her a message, kept it simple and factual, introduced myself, explained that I'd been dating her husband for 8 months, attached screenshots of our text conversations, photos of us together, everything. She responded within an hour. 3 words, "Call me, now." We talked for 2 hours that first night. She was devastated but not entirely surprised. Apparently, Marcus had been distant for months, always traveling, always busy. She'd suspected something but had no proof. Now she had more proof than she'd ever wanted. Here's the part that surprised me. We didn't turn on each other. We didn't compete for Marcus or fight over who had the right to be more upset. We bonded. Over the next few weeks, we talked constantly, shared stories, compared timelines, realized just how elaborate his double life had been. The man had been juggling 2 relationships in 2 different states and somehow thought he'd never get caught. She filed for divorce. I helped her organize evidence for her lawyer. We became this unlikely team, united by shared trauma and mutual betrayal. Marcus tried reaching out to both of us, alternating between apologies and accusations, claiming we were ganging up on him, that he'd made mistakes but we were being vindictive. The audacity of calling us vindictive for exposing his lies is really something special. His wife and I met in person once during the divorce proceedings. We got coffee and laughed about the absurdity of it all, how we'd both fallen for the same lines, believed the same excuses. She thanked me for reaching out, said if I hadn't, she might have wasted more years in a dead marriage. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. Marcus tried to make it difficult, tried to claim we'd conspired against him, but the evidence was overwhelming. His wife got a very favorable settlement. And me? I got a friend who understood exactly what it felt like to have your reality completely shattered by someone you trusted. We still talk sometimes, not about Marcus because he's not worth the breath, but about life, about healing, about how we both dodged a bullet in the long run. She's dating someone new now, someone who doesn't need a fake wedding ring for work. As for Marcus, last I heard he moved to a different state entirely, probably trying to start fresh where no one knows his history. Good luck with that in the age of the internet. At least that guy committed to one marriage. The next person couldn't even keep track of who they were supposed to be with. When Tom's dad passed away, I expected grief. I expected mood swings, withdrawal, maybe some anger. What I didn't expect was for him to suddenly become really invested in therapy. About 2 months after the funeral, he announced he'd found a therapist and would be going every Thursday evening at 7. I was actually relieved, proud even. So many men refused to deal with their emotions, and here was my husband actively seeking help to process his loss. Thursday nights became sacred. I made sure to give him space, never scheduled anything that would interfere, always had dinner ready for when he got home around 9:30. He'd come back looking emotionally drained, which made sense. Therapy is hard work. He'd usually just want to decompress quietly, maybe watch something mindless on TV, and I respected that. I thought I was being a supportive wife. This went on for 6 months, 6 months of Thursday evening therapy sessions. 6 months of me being so proud of him for doing the work. 6 months of me telling our friends how great it was that Tom was taking his mental health seriously. Then I opened our credit card statement. I usually just pay it online without looking too closely at the individual charges, but this particular month I needed to dispute something, so I was going through line by line. That's when I noticed them. Multiple charges every single Thursday night at upscale restaurants around the city. Not cheap places either. We're talking 200, 300, sometimes $400 charges. At restaurants I'd never even heard Tom mention. My first thought was fraud. Someone had stolen our card information and was living it up on our dime. But the dates were too specific, too consistent. Every Thursday. The same night as his therapy appointments. I asked Tom about it that evening, keeping my tone casual. Hey, I noticed some restaurant charges on Thursdays. Are you grabbing dinner after therapy? He didn't even hesitate. Yeah, my therapist actually recommended it. Self-care dinners. Part of processing the grief is learning to treat myself well. Do things that bring me joy. It's therapeutic. Self-care dinners at $400 a pop for 6 months. The explanation felt off, but I wanted to believe him. Grief does weird things to people, and if his therapist thought expensive meals would help, who was I to judge? Except the feeling wouldn't go away. It gnawed at me for days. Something about the whole thing just didn't add up. So I did something I'm not particularly proud of. I called the therapist's office. I'd seen the name on some paperwork Tom had left out months ago, Dr. Patricia Chen. I called and asked if I could schedule an appointment for Thursday evening around 7. The receptionist laughed. Oh, we're never open Thursday evenings. Dr. Chen doesn't see patients past 4 on Thursdays. I felt my stomach drop. I managed to stammer out something about mixing up the days, thanked her, and hung up. Then I sat there on my couch staring at my phone, trying to process what I'd just learned. Tom wasn't going to therapy on Thursday nights. He'd never been going to therapy on Thursday nights, which meant for 6 months he'd been lying to me. Every single week, using his dead father's grief as cover for whatever he was actually doing. But that wasn't even the worst part. I hired a private investigator. I know that sounds dramatic, but I needed to know the truth, and I needed proof. The PI was a middle-aged woman named Janet, who'd clearly seen every variation of this story. She didn't even seem surprised when I explained the situation. She just nodded and said she'd have answers within a week. It took 3 days. Janet sent me a folder of photographs that made me physically nauseous. Tom sitting at candlelit tables in expensive restaurants. Tom holding hands across white tablecloths. Tom kissing a woman I recognized from old photos he kept in a box in our closet. Sarah, his ex-fiancée, the one he'd dated for 3 years before we met, the one he told me he was completely over, the one he claimed he barely even thought about anymore. There were dozens of photos, different restaurants, different nights, all Thursdays. In some of them, they were just talking, but the body language was intimate. In others, they were holding hands. In several, they were kissing. Full-on, romantic. This is definitely not a friendly dinner kind of kissing. Janet's report noted that Sarah appeared to arrive and leave separately, always parking a few blocks away. Professional level sneaking around. This wasn't some spontaneous thing. This was planned, coordinated, sustained deception. I printed everything out. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt cold and clear-headed. I waited for Thursday. Tom came home that evening at 9:30. Same as always, looking appropriately drained from his fake therapy session. He kissed my forehead, asked how my day was, started making himself a snack in the kitchen. Normal Thursday night routine. I put the folder on the counter in front of him. He opened it. I watched his face go through every stage of panic. The color drained completely. His hands started shaking. He looked up at me with this expression like a kid caught stealing, and I almost felt bad for him. Almost. I didn't say anything, just waited. He tried several approaches. First, denial. That's not what it looks like. Then, minimization. It only happened a few times. Then, when I just stared at him, he landed on his final defense. Sarah's been helping me work through abandonment issues. After Dad died, I realized I had unresolved stuff from our relationship, and she agreed to meet with me to talk through it. It's basically therapy. She's helping me heal. Basically therapy. He actually said that. 6 months of romantic dinners with his ex-fiancée was basically therapy. I asked him if Sarah's husband knew about this therapeutic arrangement. Tom's face told me everything I needed to know. Here's where it gets absurd. I'd already contacted a divorce lawyer. I'd already moved money into a separate account. I'd already lined up a place to stay. I handed Tom the papers that night and told him he had until the weekend to move out of our house. Then I did one more thing. I found Sarah's husband on social media. His name was David, and from his posts he clearly had no idea his wife was spending every Thursday night on romantic dates with her ex. I sent him copies of all the photos, along with a brief note explaining that I'd just discovered the same thing he was about to discover, and I thought he deserved to know. David called me the next day. We had a long, sad conversation comparing notes. Turned out Sarah had been telling him she had a weekly book club. Book club. She'd even brought home books to make it convincing. We were both married to people who'd put serious effort into their lives. Both marriages ended. Tom tried to fight the divorce, claimed I'd violated his privacy by hiring a PI, that I was being unreasonable and not giving him a chance to explain. But the evidence was overwhelming, and more importantly, I was done. Completely, utterly done. What happened next? Nobody saw it coming. 2 months into the divorce proceedings, Tom's lawyer sent over a letter claiming I owed Tom compensation for emotional damages. According to this letter, my refusal to work through his mistake, my harsh reaction to what was merely a lapse in judgment, and my vindictive decision to expose his relationship with Sarah had caused him severe emotional distress. He was seeking $50,000 in damages. I genuinely could not believe what I was reading. The man who'd lied to me for 6 months, who'd used his father's death as cover to have an affair with his ex, who'd spent thousands of our dollars on romantic dinners while I sat at home, being a supportive wife, thought I should pay him for the emotional damage of being caught. We ended up in front of a judge for a preliminary hearing on his claim. My lawyer presented the evidence, the lies, the affair, the financial deception, all of it. Then Tom's lawyer presented his argument that Tom had been going through a difficult time and deserved compassion. The judge actually laughed, not a polite chuckle, but a real laugh. She looked at Tom and said, "Sir, you conducted a 6-month affair, lied extensively to your wife, and are now seeking financial compensation because she discovered your deception and ended the marriage. I'm dismissing this claim, and I strongly suggest you focus your energy on moving forward, rather than attempting to profit from your own misconduct." Tom's face went bright red. His lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. My lawyer gave me the tiniest smile. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. I got the house, split everything else fairly down the middle, and walked away from that marriage with my dignity intact. Tom tried to reach out a few times after everything was settled, wanting to explain, wanting closure, wanting to make me understand that he'd really been struggling and made mistakes. I never responded. There was nothing left to say. He'd turned grief into a weapon, therapy into a cover story, and our marriage into a joke. The only thing he deserved from me was silence. Last I heard, he and Sarah tried to make a go of it after both divorces were final. It lasted about 4 months before imploding spectacularly. Turns out a relationship built on lies and betrayal doesn't have the strongest foundation. They basically dug their own graves and then sent each other invitations to the funeral. But not all inappropriate relationships happen behind closed doors. Sometimes they unfold right in front of you, and somehow that makes it worse. Emma and I had been together for about 10 months when I finally got the promotion I'd been working toward for over a year. It was a big deal, a significant pay raise, a better title. the kind of career milestone that actually meant something. My parents were thrilled for me and insisted on hosting a celebratory dinner at their house. Nothing fancy, just family, good food, and a chance to mark the occasion properly. Emma seemed excited about it. She got along well with my parents, or at least I thought she did. We'd done family dinners before, holiday gatherings, the usual relationship progression stuff. Everything had always been normal, comfortable, the kind of dynamic you hope for when you're serious about someone. Dinner went great. My mum made my favorite meal, my dad opened a nice bottle of wine he'd been saving, and everyone was in good spirits. We ate, we talked, we laughed about embarrassing stories from my childhood. Standard family celebration stuff. After we finished eating, my mum started clearing plates and Emma offered to help her in the kitchen. I stayed at the table with my dad, talking about the new position, what it would mean for my career trajectory, the projects I'd be managing. Normal father-son conversation. After about 10 minutes, I realized I should probably help clean up too, so I headed toward the kitchen. That's when I heard Emma's voice, that particular tone she used when she was being flirty. I know that sound. I'd been on the receiving end of it plenty of times, but this time it wasn't directed at me. I walked into the kitchen and froze. Emma was standing close to my dad, way closer than necessary, laughing at something he'd said. Her hand was on his arm, not just a casual touch, but a deliberate placement, fingers curled around his bicep. And she was looking up at him with this expression I recognized all too well. "You're surprisingly hot for your age," she said, giving his arm a little squeeze. My dad, my actual father, didn't step back, didn't remove her hand, didn't shut it down. Instead, he flexed slightly and grinned like a teenager getting attention from the popular girl. "Well, I try to stay in shape," he said. "Still got it, right?" They both laughed. My mum was at the sink with her back turned, completely oblivious to what was happening 3 feet away from her. I stood there in the doorway trying to process what I was seeing. My girlfriend was hitting on my dad, and he was eating it up. Emma noticed me first. Her face didn't even register embarrassment or guilt. She just smiled brightly and said, "Oh babe, your dad is hilarious." We were just talking about his workout routine. My dad turned and shrugged, this sheepish grin still on his face. "She's just being friendly, son. Don't be so uptight." Uptight. He called me uptight for being uncomfortable watching my girlfriend flirt with him. I looked at Emma, then at my dad, then back at Emma. My mum turned around from the sink, sensing the tension but not understanding where it came from. "We're leaving," I said. My voice came out flat, emotionless. Emma's smile faltered. "What? Why? We haven't even had dessert yet." "Now," I said. The drive back to her apartment was silent for about 3 minutes before Emma broke it. "Are you seriously mad right now?" I kept my eyes on the road. "You were flirting with my dad." "I was not flirting. I was being nice." "God, you're being so dramatic." You touched his arm. "You called him hot. That's not being nice, that's being inappropriate. And here's where it gets absurd." She actually laughed. "You're jealous of your own father. That's insane." I pulled over to the side of the road and turned to look at her. "I'm not jealous. I'm disgusted. What you did was disrespectful to me, to my mum, and to our relationship. The fact that you can't see that is a problem." "It was just joking around," she said, but her voice had lost some of its conviction. "You're being way too sensitive about this." I started driving again. "We need to break up." The car went silent. Emma stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "You're breaking up with me because I complimented your dad? Are you hearing yourself right now? I'm breaking up with you because you don't understand boundaries. Because you thought it was appropriate to hit on my father in front of my mother. Because when I told you it made me uncomfortable, you called me insecure instead of apologizing." She started backtracking immediately. Okay, maybe I was a little too friendly. I didn't mean anything by it. I'm sorry. Can we please just talk about this?" "There's nothing to talk about," I said. I pulled up in front of her apartment building and kept the engine running. She sat there for a moment, waiting for me to change my mind, to soften, to give her another chance. When I didn't, she got out of the car and slammed the door hard enough to make the whole vehicle shake. I watched her walk into her building, then I drove straight back to my parents' house. My dad was in the living room when I walked in. My mum had gone upstairs. He looked up from his phone with this casual expression, like nothing weird had happened at all. "We need to talk," I said. His face shifted. "Look, if this is about earlier, you're overreacting. That's when everything unraveled. I told him exactly how disgusted I was, how inappropriate his behavior had been, how he disrespected Mom, disrespected me, and disrespected himself by playing into Emma's obvious flirtation. I asked him how he'd feel if I'd stood there and let one of his girlfriends from before he met Mom hit on me while he watched. That finally got through to him. His face went pale and he actually looked ashamed for the first time all evening. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was flattered and stupid. I wasn't thinking about how it looked or how it made you feel. I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. Not immediately." But it was a start. I told him we'd need to have a longer conversation about boundaries and respect. But for now, I just needed him to understand that what happened wasn't okay. He nodded, looking more uncomfortable than I'd seen him in years. Emma started texting me the next day, long paragraphs about how she'd overstepped but didn't mean anything by it, how she loved me, how we could work through this. Then came the anger texts when I didn't respond, accusations that I was throwing away our relationship over nothing, that I was being controlling and paranoid. I blocked her number after the first week. My dad and I are working on rebuilding trust. It's been slow. He apologized to my mom too, told her what happened, and they had their own conversation about it. She was furious, which she had every right to be. But they've been married for 30 years, and they're working through it. As for me, I learned something important. You can tell a lot about someone by how they react when you set a boundary. Emma couldn't handle being told her behavior was inappropriate, and my dad initially couldn't either. The difference is, my dad eventually owned his mistake. Emma never did. I'm still processing the whole thing, still feeling weird about the fact that I had to have that conversation with my father in the first place. But at least I know where my boundaries are now, and I know I'm willing to enforce them even when it's uncomfortable. The level of obliviousness required to hit on your boyfriend's dad and then act like he's the problem for being uncomfortable is truly a marvel of human psychology. Family boundary violations come in many forms, and the next story proves that sometimes the cruelty is completely calculated. Planning a wedding is stressful enough without someone actively trying to sabotage it, but that's exactly what happened to me, courtesy of my future mother-in-law, Diane. 2 months before Kyle and I were supposed to get married, she asked if she could help finalize some details. She seemed genuinely excited, genuinely invested in making our day special. I thought it would be nice to involve her, to make her feel included in the process, so I did something monumentally stupid. I gave her access to our wedding planner portal. At first, everything seemed fine. She'd send little messages about flower arrangements, ask questions about the timeline, normal mother of the groom stuff. I was actually relieved to have the help because work had been insane and I was falling behind on wedding tasks. Diane stepping up felt like a blessing. Then, about 3 weeks after I'd given her portal access, I got a call from my seamstress. She was confused because someone had called to cancel my final dress alterations. The appointment that was supposed to happen in 2 days, the one where we'd do the last fitting and make sure everything was perfect, had been wiped from the schedule. I told her there must be some mistake. I definitely hadn't cancelled. She checked her notes and said the person who called had identified themselves as the bride's mother and said the dress was no longer needed. My mom would never do that, and she definitely wouldn't claim to be me. Something felt wrong. I logged into the wedding planner portal and my stomach dropped. Everything had been changed. The venue we'd booked, the beautiful garden space we'd toured and fallen in love with and put a deposit on a year ago, had been cancelled. In its place was a reservation at some country club I'd never heard of. The menu had been completely replaced with a new one that featured every single food I'm allergic to. Shellfish, tree nuts, strawberries, all of it. It was like someone had looked at my allergy list and used it as a shopping guide. But that wasn't even the worst part. New invitations had been sent out, not to different people, but to our existing guest list, with a date that was 1 week earlier than our actual wedding date. Our guests were now expecting to show up 7 days before we'd planned, to a venue we'd never chosen, for a menu I couldn't eat. I called Kyle immediately, trying to keep my voice calm but definitely failing. He could tell something was seriously wrong. When I explained what I'd found, there was silence on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" he finally said. Maybe there was some kind of glitch in the system. I read him the confirmation emails. Each one had been approved by someone with access to our portal. There were only 3 people with that access: me, Kyle, and Diane. He said he'd talk to his mom. I could hear the doubt in his voice, like he didn't want to believe she'd do something like this. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt too, honestly. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she'd accidentally clicked the wrong buttons. Maybe there was some explanation that would make this all make sense. Diane's explanation, when Kyle called her, was that there had been a miscommunication. She thought I wanted her to finalize everything. She was just trying to help. She'd gotten confused about which venue we wanted and thought the country club would be nicer. The menu changes were because she assumed I'd want to accommodate her dietary preferences. The date change was because she thought an earlier date would be better for family travel. None of it made sense, but Kyle seemed willing to accept it. He told me his mum was just excited, maybe a little overeager, but her heart was in the right place. We could fix everything, get it back to how we wanted it. No harm done. I wanted to believe that too. I really did. But something nagged at me. So I went through the email trail in the portal more carefully, reading every message Diane had sent to our wedding planner. That's when I found it. An email from Diane to the planner, sent 2 weeks earlier. The bride has terrible taste and doesn't understand what makes a proper wedding. I need you to work with me directly to fix her mistakes. Kyle deserves better than what she's planning. I screenshot the email and sent it to Kyle without any commentary. Just the image. Let him see his mother's actual words. He called me back 10 minutes later. His voice was different, quiet and angry in a way I'd never heard before. I'm going to talk to her again, he said. This isn't okay. This is where patience finally snapped. Kyle drove to his parents' house that evening. I wasn't there for the conversation, but he told me later what happened. He showed Diane the email, asked her to explain what she meant, asked her why she'd sabotaged our wedding if she was just trying to help. She broke down crying, said she'd never thought I was good enough for Kyle, said she wanted to give him the wedding he deserved, with someone who actually appreciated what a catch he was, said she'd been hoping that if she made enough changes, maybe I'd get frustrated and call off the wedding. Then Kyle could find someone better. The woman literally admitted to trying to sabotage our relationship by ruining our wedding. And she said it while crying, like she was the victim in this scenario. Kyle uninvited her from the wedding on the spot, told her if she couldn't respect his choice of partner, she couldn't be part of celebrating that partnership. His dad tried to intervene, tried to smooth things over, but Kyle was done. He left and came straight to my apartment. We spent the next 2 weeks frantically undoing all of Diane's changes. The original venue still had our date available, thankfully. We contacted all our guests with corrected information. I rescheduled my dress alterations. We got everything back on track, but it was exhausting and stressful and took time away from actually enjoying our engagement. The wedding day arrived, and despite everything, I was excited. We'd made it. We'd survived the chaos, and we were actually going to get married. Then Diane showed up. She wasn't on the guest list anymore. Security had her name flagged, but she came anyway, wearing a white dress, full length and formal, looking every bit like she was trying to upstage the bride. She made it through the door before anyone noticed, and then she started crying loudly about how her son was making the biggest mistake of his life. Things went from bad to unhinged. She actually walked toward the altar where Kyle and I were standing, still wailing about how I'd turned her son against her, how she was his mother and deserved to be there. Our security team, 2 very large guys we'd hired specifically because we were worried something like this might happen, intercepted her halfway down the aisle. The guests were dead silent, watching this woman in a white dress being escorted out while she screamed about her rights as the mother of the groom. Kyle's face was bright red, caught between embarrassment and fury. I just stood there holding my bouquet, wondering if this was actually happening or if I'd somehow fallen into an alternate reality. Security got her outside and she was banned from the venue. We heard later that she sat in the parking lot for the entire reception, just waiting, though for what, I have no idea. Kyle and I got married. The ceremony was beautiful once we moved past the interruption. Our guests were incredibly supportive, several of them coming up afterward to say they were sorry we had to deal with that Diane's behavior was unacceptable. It actually brought everyone together in this weird way, united in their disbelief at what had just happened. After the wedding, Kyle went low contact with his mother. Not no contact, but definitely limited. Phone calls on holidays, brief visits with clear boundaries. His dad was caught in the middle, but seemed to understand why Kyle had made that choice. About a month after we got back from our honeymoon, we received a letter from Diane. Not an apology, a bill, an itemized bill for emotional distress, therapy sessions she claimed to need because of how we'd treated her, and lost time at work due to the stress we'd caused. The total came to $15,000. Kyle and I looked at each other. Then we both started laughing. The sheer audacity of it. The absolute nerve required to sabotage someone's wedding. Show up uninvited in a white dress, cause a scene, and then bill them for your own bad behavior. It was almost impressive. We framed the bill, hung it in our home office as a reminder of the chaos we'd survived. Sometimes when we're having a hard day, we look at it and remember that we made it through Diane's best efforts to destroy our relationship, and that makes current problems seem manageable. Diane has never apologized. She maintains that she was trying to protect her son from a bad decision. Kyle maintains that the only bad decision would have been letting his mother control his life. We're still married, still happy, and Diane is still firmly on the outside of our life together. The entitlement of sabotaging someone's wedding, showing up in white, causing a scene, and then sending them a bill is performance art at this point. While some people sabotage your future, others rewrite your past, sometimes in the cruelest way possible. Dylan and I had been dating for about 4 months, and honestly, things seemed pretty good. Not earth-shattering, passionate love or anything, but comfortable, easy. We texted throughout the day, saw each other a few times a week, had that nice rhythm where you're past the awkward getting to know you phase, but not quite at the serious commitment stage yet. Then one day, he just stopped responding. Completely. Mid-conversation, actually. We'd been texting about plans for the weekend, and he just went silent. I figured maybe his phone died, maybe he got busy at work, maybe he fell asleep. It happens. I didn't think much of it. By the next day, I was starting to feel a little concerned. I'd sent a couple follow-up texts, nothing desperate, just casual check-ins, still nothing. No read receipts, no response, nothing. I tried calling, straight to voicemail. That's when the worry started creeping in. This wasn't like Dylan. He was usually pretty good about communication. On day 3, I got a text, but it wasn't from Dylan. It was from his roommate, Chris, a guy I'd met a handful of times when picking Dylan up or dropping him off. The message said, "Hey, this is Chris. I'm really sorry to tell you this, but Dylan was in a serious car accident. He's in the ICU right now. It's pretty bad. I'll keep you updated." I felt like the floor dropped out from under me. My hands started shaking as I read the message over and over, trying to process it. A car accident. ICU. Pretty bad. All the worst-case scenarios started flooding my brain. Was he going to be okay? How bad was bad? Why hadn't anyone called me sooner? I immediately texted back asking which hospital, what happened, if he was going to be all right. Chris responded with the name of a hospital across town and said the doctors were still assessing the damage, but it didn't look good. He said Dylan's family was there and they were all just waiting and hoping. I was devastated, absolutely gutted. I'd been annoyed about being ghosted, and the whole time he'd been in the hospital fighting for his life. I felt terrible for every irritated thought I'd had over the past few days. I wanted to go to the hospital immediately, but Chris said the ICU had strict visiting restrictions and only family was allowed. He promised to keep me updated and said he'd let me know when Dylan was stable enough for visitors. I sent flowers, ordered them online, had them delivered to the hospital with a card saying I was thinking of him and hoping for a speedy recovery. I texted Chris asking if they'd arrived, if Dylan had seen them, how he was doing. Chris said the flowers were beautiful and Dylan would love them when he woke up. When he woke up, like he was in a coma or something, the whole thing was terrifying. I spent the next few days in this awful limbo, checking my phone constantly for updates from Chris, crying randomly when I thought about Dylan lying in a hospital bed, telling my friends and family what had happened. Everyone was so sympathetic, so supportive. My mom even offered to come stay with me for a few days because she could tell I was struggling. A week went by. Chris's updates were vague, still in ICU. Doctors are monitoring. Family is staying hopeful. Nothing concrete, nothing that gave me a real sense of what was happening. I started to feel like something was off, but I pushed the feeling down. Of course the updates were vague. This was a traumatic situation. Chris probably didn't want to overshare medical details. But then I called the hospital directly. I just wanted to send more flowers, maybe a card, anything to show Dylan I was thinking of him. I called the main number and asked to be connected to his room. The operator paused. I'm sorry, we don't have a patient by that name. I spelled it out for her, gave her his full name, said he'd been admitted over a week ago after a car accident. She checked again. Nothing. No Dylan, no recent accident victims matching his description, no record of him ever being admitted. That sick feeling in my stomach intensified. Maybe he'd been transferred to another hospital. Maybe they'd discharged him already. I called Chris. He didn't answer. I called again. Voicemail. That's when I decided to call Dylan's mum. I'd met her once, briefly, and I still had her number saved from when Dylan had given it to me in case of emergency. This felt like an emergency. She answered on the second ring, sounding cheerful and normal. When I asked about Dylan's accident, about how he was recovering, there was a long pause. What accident? My heart sank. I explained what Chris had told me. The car accident, the ICU, the week of waiting for updates. She listened to the whole thing and then said very carefully, Dylan is fine. He's at work right now. There was no accident. Then came the breaking point. I hung up with his mum and just sat there, trying to piece together what had happened. Dylan wasn't in the hospital. He'd never been in the hospital. Which meant Chris had lied to me. Which meant Dylan had probably asked him to lie to me. Which meant the guy I'd been dating, the guy I'd been worried sick about, had faked a serious car accident to avoid breaking up with me like a normal human being. The anger hit me like a wave. Not just anger, but humiliation. I'd sent flowers. I'd cried. I'd told everyone I knew. I'd been genuinely terrified for his well-being. And the whole time, he was just fine, going about his life, probably laughing about how easily I'd believed the story. I wanted to confront him immediately, but I didn't have a way to reach him. He'd ghosted me, remember? His phone was apparently off or he was ignoring me. So I waited, and I stewed, and I planned exactly what I was going to say when I finally saw him again. 2 weeks after the fake accident, I went out with friends to a bar downtown. We were having drinks, trying to have a good time, and I was actually starting to feel a little better about the whole situation. At least I'd dodged a bullet with Dylan. At least I'd found out he was a coward before things got serious. Then I saw him, Dylan, very much alive, very much healthy, very much not recovering from a serious car accident. He was at the bar with a girl I didn't recognize, leaning in close, laughing at something she said, living his best life while I'd spent 2 weeks thinking he might die. He saw me at the exact same moment I saw him. His face went completely white. He actually tried to hide behind the girl he was with, like I might not have already seen him. I didn't even think. I just walked straight over to their table. The girl looked up at me confused. Dylan looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. I smiled at both of them and said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "Wow, you recovered from that coma fast? What hospital were you at again? I tried to visit, but they said you were never admitted." The girl's confusion deepened. Dylan started stammering something about it being complicated, about how he could explain. "Let me save you the trouble," I said to her. "This is my ex-boyfriend." Well, I thought he was my ex, but he never actually broke up with me. Instead, he had his roommate tell me he was in a serious car accident and in the ICU. I sent flowers to a hospital where he was never a patient. I called his mother thinking he might die. Turns out he was just too much of a coward to have a normal breakup conversation. Things went from bad to unhinged. She stared at Dylan with this look of absolute disgust. "You did what?" Dylan tried to explain. He said he panicked, that he didn't know how to end things, that he thought if I believed he was in an accident, I'd just move on naturally and nobody would get hurt. "Nobody would get hurt," I repeated. "You faked a tragedy because you were too scared to text me saying it wasn't working out. Do you understand how insane that is?" The girl stood up, grabbed her purse, and told Dylan she was leaving. He tried to stop her, but she just shook her head and walked out. Can't say I blamed her. Dylan turned back to me, looking desperate. "I'm sorry, okay? It was stupid. I know it was stupid. I just didn't want to hurt you. You faked a car accident," I said slowly. "You let me think you were dying. You let me send flowers and cry and worry for 2 weeks. And you did that because you didn't want to hurt me?" He had no answer for that. I told him that faking a tragedy to avoid a basic human conversation was genuinely sociopathic behavior, that I hoped he got help, that I never wanted to see him again. Then I walked back to my friends, who'd watched the whole thing unfold with their mouths hanging open. About a week later, Chris texted me, a real text this time, not a fake emergency update. He apologized profusely, said it was the dumbest plan ever, that he'd told Dylan it was a terrible idea, but went along with it anyway. He felt awful about the whole thing. I appreciated the apology, but I told him I wasn't interested in maintaining any connection to Dylan or his friends. I blocked both of them and moved on with my life. The sheer creativity people will deploy to avoid a 30-second uncomfortable conversation never stops being astounding. Faking emergencies is one thing, but exploiting real family crisis? That's a whole different level of betrayal. I was scrolling through Facebook on a random Tuesday evening when I got a message from someone I didn't know. The profile picture showed a woman in her 30s, smiling with two kids. The message said, "Hey, I know this is weird, but are you the baby from the viral formula ad campaign from the 90s? I have your picture on my fridge and my sister swears she went to college with you." I stared at that message for a solid 5 minutes, trying to figure out if this was some kind of scam or weird joke. What formula ad campaign? What picture on her fridge? I responded asking what she was talking about, and she sent me a photo. It was me. Definitely me. A picture of me as a baby, maybe 6 months old, giggling at the camera with this huge toothless smile. I recognized the outfit, this little yellow onesie my mum had dressed me in constantly. But I'd never seen this particular photo before, and I definitely didn't know it had been used in any ad campaign. The woman explained that this photo had been part of a major formula brand's marketing push in the late 90s. It was everywhere, apparently. Magazines, billboards, the backs of parenting publications. She'd kept it because it reminded her of her own daughter at that age. She thought it was so cool that she might actually know the person in the photo. I thanked her for reaching out and then immediately called my mum. Asked her if she knew anything about my baby photos being used in advertisements. There was this long pause on the other end of the line, and I knew. I knew before she even said anything that something was very wrong here. "Oh, that," she said, like it was nothing. "Yeah, we licensed some of your photos when you were little. You were such a cute baby. Companies loved using your pictures." I felt my grip tighten on my phone. "You did what?" "It was a long time ago, honey. We needed the money and you were too young to care. It's not a big deal." But that wasn't even the worst part. I started digging. I reverse image searched that formula ad photo and found dozens of results. My face was everywhere. Diaper commercials, parenting blogs, baby food packaging, educational materials about infant development. Stock photo websites still actively licensing images of me as a baby and toddler. Each site listed the photos as available for purchase, with my childhood face being sold over and over to whoever wanted to use it for whatever purpose. I found photos I'd never seen before, pictures from moments I didn't remember, couldn't remember, because I was too young. Birthday parties, bath time, me sleeping, me crying, me playing with toys, all of them professionally shot, which meant my parents had deliberately hired photographers to create content they could sell. I went through my parents' social media and old emails trying to piece together the timeline. They'd started when I was about 3 months old and continued until I was around 5. Hundreds of photos. They'd worked with multiple stock agencies creating a whole portfolio of my childhood that they'd then monetized. I made a spreadsheet. I contacted every company and website I could find that had used my photos and asked for their licensing records. Most of them couldn't or wouldn't share that information, but a few did. I started calculating. Low estimates based on standard stock photo rates, multiplied by the number of uses I could verify, came out to over $50,000. That was just what I could prove. The actual number was probably higher, $50,000. My parents had made $50,000 selling pictures of me as a child, and I'd never seen a cent of it. Never even knew it was happening. I drove to their house that weekend, brought my laptop with all the evidence, sat them down at their kitchen table and showed them everything I'd found. My dad looked uncomfortable. My mum looked defensive. "So what?" she said. "You were a baby. You didn't need the money then. We were your parents. We had the right to make those decisions." I asked them where the money went. What had they spent it on? My mum waved her hand vaguely. "Life expenses, things we needed, this and that." My dad finally spoke up. We took some nice vacations, paid off credit cards, fixed the roof. Normal stuff, normal stuff. They'd sold my image, my childhood, my face that strangers still recognized decades later, for vacations and credit card debt. I asked if they'd ever planned to tell me. My mom said there was nothing to tell. It was their right as parents to profit from photos they'd taken of their own child. Legally, she was right. Minors don't own their own image in most cases. Parents can license photos of their kids without permission or compensation. It's perfectly legal. But legal doesn't mean ethical, and here's where it gets absurd. I told them I wanted them to stop. No more licensing, no more renewals, no new contracts. My childhood was over and they needed to stop selling it. My mom actually laughed. Those photos are ours. We own them. We can do whatever we want with them. I left their house and went straight to a lawyer who specialized in image rights and privacy law. She confirmed what my mum had said. The photos belonged to my parents, but she also said there were options. We could send cease and desist letters to the stock agencies, arguing that continued use constituted a violation of my current privacy rights. We could threaten legal action against new licensing. We couldn't undo what had already happened, but we could try to stop it from continuing. We sent the letters. Most agencies complied, removing my photos from their active catalogs. A few pushed back, but eventually agreed when my lawyer made it clear we were serious about pursuing this. The photos are still out there, already purchased and used by countless companies, but at least they're not being actively sold anymore. My parents were furious. They called me ungrateful, said they'd given me everything, raised me well, and this was how I repaid them, by threatening legal action over a few photos. They couldn't understand why I was so upset about something that had happened so long ago. But here's the thing they don't get. Every time someone at work randomly mentions seeing my face on some old parenting blog, I feel violated all over again. Every time I find a new use of those photos that I didn't know about, it's a fresh reminder that my parents saw me as a product, not their child, but a revenue stream. I found out that a colleague had actually used one of my baby photos in a presentation about child development, completely unaware that the anonymous stock photo baby was sitting 3 desks away from her. Another coworker had my picture in a parenting book on his shelf at home. These people saw my childhood face in professional contexts and never made the connection. I existed in their world as both a real person and a commodified image of infancy. The strangest part was going through old family albums and seeing the difference between candid photos my parents took just for memories and the ones they'd clearly staged for stock agencies. The lighting was different. My outfits were more coordinated. They'd posed me deliberately, creating marketable moments instead of just capturing real ones. Even my childhood memories were split into 2 categories now: genuine family moments and photo shoots designed to generate income. Then came the breaking point. I discovered they were still trying to license photos. Despite the cease and desist letters, despite our conversation, they'd contacted a smaller stock agency that specialized in nostalgic retro imagery. Apparently, photos from the 90s were having a moment, and my parents saw an opportunity. They'd pitched an entire portfolio of my childhood photos as authentic vintage content. The agency had actually reached out to my lawyer to verify rights, which is how I found out. They wanted to make sure there wouldn't be legal issues before moving forward. My lawyer shut it down immediately and sent another, much firmer cease and desist to my parents directly. My mom called me screaming, said I was trying to control them, trying to dictate what they could do with their own property. Said those photos represented their memories too, their time and effort as parents, and I had no right to take that away from them. I told her those photos represented my face, my body, my childhood that I didn't consent to having sold. She hung up on me. We haven't spoken in 8 months now. They send occasional emails saying I'm being dramatic, that I'm blowing this out of proportion, that families should forgive and move on. But they've never apologized, never acknowledged that what they did was wrong. They genuinely believed they were entitled to profit from my image because they were my parents. I think about this a lot. About consent and childhood, and who owns our early years. About the fact that I have co-workers who've seen me naked as a baby without knowing it was me. About the stranger with my photo on her fridge. About the fact that somewhere out there, my infant face is probably still on someone's blog or in someone's marketing materials, and there's nothing I can do about it. My parents took my childhood and turned it into a business venture without ever asking if that was okay. They made decisions about my privacy, my image, my future ability to control my own narrative, all before I was old enough to have a say. And when I finally did have a say, when I asked them to stop, they told me I was ungrateful. They really looked at their infant child and saw dollar signs, then got mad when that child grew up and had feelings about being commodified. At least those parents waited until after the moment to exploit it. The next family member couldn't even let someone have their own announcement. I was 12 weeks pregnant and terrified. Not because I didn't want the baby, I absolutely did, but because I knew how fragile early pregnancy could be. I'd read all the statistics, heard all the stories from friends who'd miscarried in the first trimester. So my husband and I made a decision. We'd wait until the second trimester, until we were past that risky first phase, before we told anyone. Anyone except my sister, Lauren. I told her at 10 weeks. We were close, or at least I thought we were, and I needed someone to talk to about the morning sickness, the exhaustion, the weird food aversions. I made her promise not to tell anyone, literally made her swear on it. She hugged me and said, "Of course, your secret's safe with me. I won't say a word." 2 days later, I woke up to my phone vibrating non-stop. 47 Facebook notifications, texts from people I hadn't talked to in months, missed calls from my mum, my mother-in-law, friends from college. I grabbed my phone, confused and still half asleep, and opened Facebook. Lauren had posted a status. "So excited to be an auntie. Can't wait to meet this little one." And she'd attached a photo, my ultrasound photo, the one I kept in my purse from my last appointment, the one she must have taken out and photographed without asking, without telling me, without any regard for the fact that it wasn't hers to share. My heart started racing. I scrolled through the comments. Congratulations poured in. From my parents, who I'd been planning to tell in person that weekend. From my in-laws, who deserved to hear it from their son. From my boss, who now knew I was pregnant before I'd had a chance to figure out maternity leave. From distant relatives and old friends, and people I barely remembered from high school. Everyone knew. Everyone knew before I could tell them myself. The moment I'd been planning, the announcements I'd been thinking about, the careful way I wanted to share this news, all of it was gone. Stolen by my sister's inability to keep her mouth shut for 2 more weeks. I called her immediately. She answered on the first ring, sounding chipper and excited. "Did you see all the congratulations? Everyone's so happy for you." I could barely get the words out. "You posted my ultrasound on Facebook. Without asking me, I told you in confidence." There was a pause. Then she laughed. A real laugh, like I'd said something funny. I was just excited. "Come on, you're being dramatic. Everyone would have found out soon anyway." "That's not the point," I said. My voice was shaking. "You stole my announcement. You went through my purse, took my ultrasound photo, and shared my private medical information with hundreds of people before I was ready. That's not being excited. That's being selfish." She got defensive immediately. "Oh my God, you're making this about you. I'm going to be an aunt. I'm allowed to be excited about that. You're just hormonal and overreacting. Hormonal and overreacting." She actually said that. I hung up on her. Then I spent the next hour fielding calls and texts from people who wanted to congratulate me. My mom was hurt that she'd found out on Facebook. My mother-in-law was confused about why we hadn't told them first. My boss wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss my plans. Every conversation was tinged with this awkwardness, this knowledge that this wasn't how it was supposed to happen. But that wasn't even the worst part. I decided to take control of the narrative. I deleted Lauren's post from my timeline and made my own announcement. I kept it simple but honest. Yes, I'm pregnant. I'm 12 weeks along and was planning to announce after my next appointment. My sister shared this news without my permission, which wasn't how I wanted you all to find out. But here we are. I'm excited to be a mum and appreciate all the support. The response was overwhelming. People were supportive, but they were also shocked. Several friends messaged me privately saying what Lauren did was out of line. My mum called again, this time understanding why I was upset. Even people who didn't know Lauren well commented that sharing someone else's pregnancy announcement was a major breach of trust. Lauren saw the post, and instead of apologizing, instead of recognizing what she'd done wrong, she doubled down. She made her own post saying she was being mom-shamed for being excited about her niece or nephew, that I was being ungrateful for her love and support, that she didn't deserve to be publicly called out for sharing happy news. Mom-shamed. I wasn't even a mum yet, and she was accusing me of mom-shaming her for violating my privacy. I blocked her on every platform, phone, Facebook, Instagram, everything. I didn't want to see her justifications or her victim narrative. I didn't want to engage with someone who couldn't understand why what she did was wrong. 3 days later, she showed up at my house, just appeared on my doorstep, ringing the bell repeatedly until I answered. When I opened the door, she started yelling before I could say anything. "You blocked me, your own sister, over a Facebook post. Do you know how ridiculous that is?" I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. I didn't want this conversation happening where my husband could hear, where it could escalate into a scene. "You violated my trust," I said quietly. "I told you I was pregnant in confidence, and you shared that information, along with my private medical photo, without my permission. You stole my announcement, and when I told you how hurt I was, you dismissed my feelings and made yourself the victim." She crossed her arms. "I came here for an apology, and instead you're still attacking me." "I'm not apologizing," I said. "You need to leave." This is where patience finally snapped. She refused to go, said she wasn't leaving until we worked this out, until I understood that she didn't do anything wrong. I told her again to leave or I'd call the police. She laughed, said I wouldn't dare, that I was being ridiculous. I pulled out my phone and started dialing. She finally left, but not before saying I'd regret this, that I was ruining our relationship over nothing, that when the baby came, I'd realize how important family was. I told her she could meet my baby when she learned what boundaries were. Then I went inside and locked the door. My parents got involved. They called me that evening, said Lauren was devastated, that I was being too harsh, that family was supposed to forgive each other. I explained what happened from start to finish. My mum said she understood, but thought I should give Lauren another chance. My dad said I was holding a grudge over something small. Something small. My pregnancy announcement was something small. I told them that until Lauren apologized and showed she understood why her actions were wrong, I needed space from her. And if they couldn't respect that boundary, I'd need space from them too. My mum got quiet. My dad said I was being unreasonable. I limited their access. No more daily calls, no more dropping by unannounced, no detailed updates about the pregnancy. They'd still be involved, but on my terms, with clear boundaries about what information they could and couldn't share. Lauren never apologized, not once. She maintained that she did nothing wrong, that I overreacted, that I was the one who needed to make amends. My parents eventually accepted my boundaries, though they still think I should forgive her. Some extended family members took her side, said I was being petty, that pregnancy hormones were making me irrational. It's been 3 years. My daughter is 2.5. She's never met her Aunt Lauren. My parents see her, but it took time to rebuild that trust. They know now that if they share photos or information without my permission, their access gets restricted. They've learned to respect the boundary. I don't regret my decision. What Lauren did wasn't just about a Facebook post. It was about control, about making my pregnancy about her excitement instead of my experience. It was about violating trust and then refusing to take responsibility. Those aren't traits I want around my daughter. People ask sometimes if I'll ever reconcile with her. Maybe. If she ever genuinely apologizes and shows she understands why her actions were harmful. But I'm not holding my breath. Some people are fundamentally incapable of seeing past their own perspective. The mental gymnastics required to steal someone's pregnancy announcement and then claim you're the victim is Olympic level. But stolen moments are nothing compared to stolen identities, especially when it involves someone who's supposed to be dead. I was doing a routine background check on myself before starting a new job. You know how it is. You want to make sure there aren't any surprises when your potential employer runs your name through their systems. I Googled my full name plus my city, expecting to find my LinkedIn profile, maybe some old social media posts, the usual digital footprint everyone has these days. Instead, I found an obituary, my Aunt Patricia's obituary, from 2019. My first thought was that someone had made a mistake, some weird glitch in the system, a mix-up with names, but I'd just seen Patricia at Thanksgiving 3 weeks ago. She'd been very much alive, eating turkey and complaining about the cranberry sauce like she did every year. So I clicked on the obituary, figuring I'd get a laugh out of whatever weird coincidence had led to this error. That's when my stomach dropped. The obituary didn't list Patricia's information. It listed mine. My full legal name, my birth date, my hometown. Even the survived by section mentioned my parents, not hers. This wasn't Patricia's obituary at all. It was mine. Except I wasn't dead. I started digging deeper, my hands shaking as I typed. I found the funeral home that had posted the notice and called them immediately. The woman who answered sounded confused when I explained the situation. She put me on hold, came back, and said that Patricia Henderson, the woman who'd arranged everything, had presented a death certificate and identification. Everything had seemed legitimate at the time. I asked if she still had copies of those documents. She said they were required to keep records and could send them to me. When the files arrived in my email an hour later, I saw exactly what Patricia had done. She'd somehow obtained a fraudulent death certificate in my name, presented it along with identification that used my information, and officially declared me dead. But that wasn't even the worst part. I pulled my credit report that same day. The moment it loaded, I felt sick. There were accounts I'd never opened, credit cards from stores I'd never shopped at, a car loan for a vehicle I'd never seen, a lease for an apartment in a city I'd never lived in. All of it opened within the past 3 years. All of it in my name. All of it destroying my credit score, which had plummeted from the high 700s to the low 500s. Patricia hadn't just faked her death. She'd stolen my entire identity and built a new life with it. I started making calls, credit card companies, the credit bureaus, the apartment complex. Each conversation revealed more of the picture. Patricia had been using my social security number to apply for everything. She had a job where she'd listed my information on her employment paperwork. She'd been living as me for 3 years while I had no idea. The apartment complex sent me a copy of the lease application. There was a photo ID attached. It was Patricia's face, but the name on the ID was mine. She'd somehow created fake identification documents using my information and her picture. I needed to confront her, but I also needed evidence. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in identity theft. He told me to file a police report immediately and to gather every document I could find showing the fraudulent accounts. He also said I should record the conversation with Patricia if my state allowed single-party consent recording. It did. I called her and asked if we could meet for coffee. She agreed easily, sounding cheerful and completely unconcerned. We met at a cafe near her apartment, the apartment she was renting under my name, and I started recording on my phone before I even sat down. I showed her the obituary first, asked her if she knew anything about it. She barely glanced at it before shrugging. Oh, that. Yeah, I needed a fresh start. The debt collectors were getting aggressive and I couldn't deal with it anymore. Just like that. Casual. Like she was explaining why she'd changed her hairstyle. You faked your death using my information, I said, keeping my voice level. You've been living under my name for 3 years. She sighed like I was being difficult. It's not that big a deal. You're young enough to rebuild your credit. I needed this more than you did. I had creditors calling me constantly, threatening to garnish my wages. What was I supposed to do? Not commit identity theft, I said. Not destroy my credit and my reputation. Not steal my entire identity. She waved her hand dismissively. You're being dramatic. I didn't hurt anyone. You still have your job, your apartment, your life. I just borrowed your information to get a second chance. And here's where it gets absurd. I asked her if she understood that what she'd done was illegal. She looked at me like I was stupid. Technically, maybe. But you're family. You're not actually going to press charges over this, right? We can work something out. I'll pay you back eventually. I stood up and told her I'd already filed a police report. Her face went pale. You what? I reported identity theft. Because that's what this is. You committed fraud, Patricia. Multiple counts. You're going to face consequences for this. She started yelling right there in the cafe. Called me vindictive, ungrateful, cruel. Said she couldn't believe I'd turn on family like this. Said she'd done what she had to do to survive, and I was being heartless. People were staring, but I didn't care. I walked out while she was still shouting. The police arrested her 2 weeks later. The evidence was overwhelming. The fake death certificate, the fraudulent identification, the credit accounts, the apartment lease, the employment records. All of it pointed directly to her. She'd left a paper trail a mile wide because she genuinely hadn't thought she'd ever get caught. Then came the breaking point. My family found out about the arrest, and they came after me. Not Patricia, the person who'd committed multiple felonies. Me, the victim. My mom called crying, saying I was ruining Patricia's life over a mistake. My uncle said I was being vindictive and should have handled this privately. Cousins I barely knew messaged me on Facebook calling me heartless and cruel. Patricia had apparently told everyone that I'd blown things out of proportion, that she'd made a small error in judgment, and I'd responded by having her arrested. She'd positioned herself as the victim and me as the villain, and half the family had bought it. I sent them all the documentation, the credit reports, the fraudulent accounts, the obituary, the fake death certificate, everything. Some of them went quiet after that. Others doubled down, saying family should forgive family, that I should have given her a chance to make things right before involving the police. The legal process took 2 years. 2 years of paperwork, court dates, disputes with credit agencies, hours on the phone with fraud departments. 2 years of my life spent cleaning up the mess Patricia had made. My lawyer said it was one of the most extensive identity theft cases he'd seen, especially within a family. Patricia got probation and community service. That's it. Barely a slap on the wrist for destroying my credit, stealing my identity, and faking my death. The judge said because she was a first-time offender and showed remorse, which she definitely didn't, a lenient sentence was appropriate. She stood up in court and said she didn't hurt anyone, that she'd just been trying to survive, that the system had failed her and she'd done what she had to do. She never once apologized to me, never acknowledged the damage she'd caused, never took actual responsibility for her choices. My credit is slowly recovering. I've gotten most of the fraudulent accounts removed, though a few are still being disputed. My score has climbed back into the low 600s. The lawyer said it might take another few years to fully recover, if it ever fully does, but the betrayal, that's permanent. The knowledge that my own aunt looked at me and saw an opportunity to exploit, that she felt entitled to my identity, my future, my financial stability, because she'd made bad choices and needed an escape route. We don't speak anymore. Most of the family that sided with her, I've cut off too. The ones who understood, who saw how serious this was, they're still in my life. But family gatherings are smaller now, quieter, tinged with the absence of people who chose to defend a criminal over supporting a victim. Patricia still tells people she didn't do anything wrong. I heard through the grapevine that she's bitter about the probation, feels like she was treated unfairly by the justice system. The irony would be funny if it wasn't so infuriating. She literally stole a person's entire existence and then got mad about facing barely any consequences for it. Identity theft within families is devastating, but workplace identity theft, where someone literally steals your accomplishments, might be even more infuriating. I'd spent 6 months on this project, 6 months of late nights, weekend work, endless data analysis, and strategy revisions. I'd developed a complete client retention strategy from scratch, built segmentation models, tested different approaches, and finally landed on something that actually worked. The results spoke for themselves. 40% increase in revenue from existing clients. 40%. That kind of number doesn't happen by accident. My boss Richard had been supportive throughout the process. Or at least, I thought he had been. He'd check in on my progress, ask questions about my methodology, review my findings. I kept him updated via email, sent him detailed reports, included him in every major decision. I thought I was being a good team player, keeping my manager in the loop. I had no idea I was actually giving him a roadmap to steal my work. The quarterly executive meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday morning. The day before, Richard called me into his office and told me I was being promoted to senior analyst. I was thrilled. This was exactly the kind of recognition I'd been working toward. He said he'd announce it at the meeting and that I should be prepared to answer any questions about my retention project if the executives wanted details. I walked into that conference room feeling proud and confident. I'd earned this promotion. My work had generated real results for the company. I sat down near the middle of the table, notebook ready, waiting for my moment. Richard started the meeting with general updates, then moved into announcements. He mentioned my promotion, and everyone clapped politely. I smiled, nodded my thanks. Then he said he wanted to share some exciting results from a new client retention strategy. My retention strategy. The one I'd spent half a year developing. He pulled up a presentation on the screen. My presentation. The slides I'd created, the data I'd analyzed, the charts I'd designed. Every single element was mine. But when Richard started talking, he said, I developed this approach after analyzing our client churn patterns. I developed. Not we, not my team, not even giving me credit as a contributor. He was claiming sole ownership of my work. I sat there frozen, watching him present my strategy as his own creation. He talked through the segmentation model, the implementation timeline, the revenue impact. He used all my words, all my analysis, all my insights. The executives were nodding, impressed. One of them even said, "Richard, this is excellent work, really innovative thinking." Richard smiled and said, "Thank you." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. This man had just promoted me and was now actively stealing credit for the work that justified that promotion. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. And here's where it gets absurd. Richard opened the floor for questions. He looked confident, relaxed, like he'd actually done the work he was presenting. One of the executives asked about implementation challenges. Richard gave a vague answer about change management and stakeholder buy-in. Safe, generic corporate speak that could apply to any project. Then I raised my hand. Richard looked surprised but nodded at me. I kept my voice calm and professional. "Richard, can you explain the methodology behind the segmentation model? Specifically, how did you determine the optimal number of client segments?" It was a technical question. A question that anyone who'd actually built the model would be able to answer easily. I watched the color drain from Richard's face. He stammered something about data-driven analysis and iterative testing. Buzzwords, nothing substantive. I let him struggle for about 30 seconds before I spoke again. "That's interesting, because when I created this model, I used a completely different approach. Would you like me to explain the actual methodology?" The room went completely silent. Every executive turned to look at me, then back at Richard. You could see the realization dawning on their faces. The VP of Operations, a woman named Margaret, who I'd worked with on a few cross-functional projects, spoke up. She looked directly at me and said, "Why don't you walk us through your process?" I stood up and moved to the front of the room. Richard sat down in my vacated seat, his face bright red. I went through the entire presentation again, but this time I explained the actual work behind it. The statistical analysis I'd used to determine segment counts, the A/B testing I'd conducted to validate the approach, the specific challenges I'd encountered and how I'd solved them. I pulled up emails I'd sent Richard throughout the process, showing timestamps and detailed updates. I made it very clear, without explicitly saying it, that this was my work, my strategy, my 6 months of effort. The executives asked intelligent questions and I answered all of them. Richard sat silent, staring at the table. When I finished, Margaret thanked me and said the meeting was adjourned. People filed out quietly. Richard left quickly without making eye contact with anyone. About an hour later, Margaret called me into her office. She asked me directly if I'd created the retention strategy. I said yes and showed her the complete email trail. Every update I'd sent Richard, every milestone I'd documented, every piece of analysis I'd shared. The timestamps made it undeniable. I'd been working on this for months, sending Richard regular updates, keeping him informed as my manager. Margaret looked furious, not at me, but at the situation. She said she'd need to discuss this with the other executives and HR, but that I should know this kind of behavior was completely unacceptable. What happened next? Nobody saw it coming. 2 weeks later, Richard was demoted, not fired, which honestly surprised me, but moved to a lateral position with no direct reports. The official reason was restructuring. But everyone knew what had really happened, and his old position, Director of Client Strategy, was offered to me. I'd gone from Senior Analyst, the promotion I was supposed to be celebrating, to Director in 2 weeks. I'd leapfrogged over Richard entirely. He showed up at my new office the day after the announcement was made. He didn't knock, just walked in and started yelling. He said I'd ambushed him in that meeting, that I'd deliberately tried to make him look bad, that I'd sabotaged his career out of petty jealousy. I let him finish. Then I said, very calmly, "No, Richard, I refuse to let you steal my future." He wanted to keep arguing, but I told him to leave. When he didn't move, I picked up my phone and called security. He left before they arrived, but not before telling me I'd regret this. The next few months were tense. Richard still worked in the building, still attended some of the same meetings. He'd make passive-aggressive comments, try to undermine my decisions, spread rumors that I'd only gotten promoted because I'd thrown him under the bus. Some people believed him, but most people had been in that meeting. They'd seen him present work he couldn't explain. They'd watched him flounder when asked basic questions about his supposed strategy. My team rallied around me. Several of them had suspected Richard was taking credit for their work too, but had never had the leverage or courage to call him out. One analyst told me that Richard had presented her competitive analysis as his own work to a client. Another said he'd claimed credit for process improvements the whole team had developed together. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. Richard had built his career by stealing credit from the people who reported to him. HR launched a broader investigation. They interviewed former team members, reviewed old presentations, compared work products to the people who'd actually created them. Richard ended up leaving the company entirely about 6 months after my promotion. The official story was that he was pursuing other opportunities. The real story was that once people started actually looking at his track record, it became obvious he'd been coasting on other people's work for years. I still think about that moment in the conference room sometimes. The choice I made to speak up instead of staying silent. It would have been safer to let it go, to accept my senior analyst promotion and not rock the boat. But something in me couldn't let him get away with it. Not just for my sake, but for everyone else he'd done this to. Taking credit for your employees' work and then being unable to answer basic questions about it in front of executives is a masterclass in self-destruction. At least that boss tried to be subtle. Some coworkers don't even bother hiding their sabotage. Jennifer and I had worked together in the accounting department for about 2 years. We weren't friends exactly, but we were cordial, professional. We'd grab coffee sometimes, make small talk about weekend plans, the usual co-worker relationship. I never had any reason to think she'd throw me under the bus at the first opportunity. I was doing a routine quarterly audit, one of those tedious tasks where you go through invoices and payments line by line to make sure everything matches up. It's boring work, but it's important. That's when I noticed the discrepancy. A client invoice that was supposed to be for $15,000 had been entered as $30,000. Someone had made a calculation error, and it had resulted in us overcharging a major client by 15 grand. I checked the document history to see who'd created the original invoice. Jennifer's name was right there in the metadata. It was an honest mistake, the kind of thing that happens when you're working with spreadsheets all day and transpose a number or miss a decimal point. I wasn't trying to get her in trouble. I just wanted to fix it before it became a bigger problem. I walked over to her desk and quietly told her what I'd found. Showed her the invoice, pointed out the error, suggested we could correct it and send an amended bill to the client before anyone higher up noticed. She looked at the numbers, and for a second I saw panic flash across her face. Then she thanked me, said she'd take care of it right away, and I went back to my desk thinking the problem was solved. 2 days later, I got called into HR. The HR director, Margaret, looked serious when I walked in. She asked me to sit down and then told me there had been a complaint filed against me. A serious complaint. Apparently, I had made a significant accounting error that cost the company money and client trust, and when confronted about it, I'd tried to blame a coworker. I stared at her, completely confused. What error? What coworker? She pulled out printed emails. Communications between Jennifer and me, discussing the invoice error. Except in these emails, I was the one who'd made the mistake. Jennifer had supposedly discovered it and brought it to my attention, and I'd responded defensively, trying to claim it was her fault. I'd never sent those emails. I'd never even written those words. But there they were, with my name on them, with my email address in the header. Margaret said they were launching a formal investigation and that I was being suspended without pay, pending the outcome. I tried to explain that those emails were fake, that Jennifer had made the error and I'd tried to help her fix it, but Margaret just said the investigation would determine the facts. I was escorted out of the building that afternoon, suspended without pay, with my professional reputation on the line, accused of something I didn't do by someone I'd tried to help. I felt sick, betrayed, terrified that I was going to lose my job over Jennifer's lie. But that wasn't even the worst part. I went home and started going through everything I had. My own emails, my notes, anything that could prove my version of events. That's when I remembered something our IT department had mentioned in a training session months ago. Our company used software that tracked every edit made to every document. Not just who created something, but every change, every revision, every timestamp. A complete audit trail. I called a lawyer that night, explained the situation, told him about the doctored emails and the suspension. He said if the company had an audit trail system, that would be our smoking gun. He'd come with me to HR and we'd request the full documentation. The meeting happened 3 days later. I showed up with my lawyer, which clearly surprised Margaret. She seemed less confident now, more willing to listen. My lawyer explained that we were requesting the complete audit trail for all documents related to the invoice in question, including the emails Jennifer had submitted as evidence. Margaret agreed and contacted IT right there in the meeting. It took them about an hour to pull everything together and send it over. When Margaret opened the files, I watched her face change. She went pale, then her jaw tightened. The audit trail showed everything. Jennifer had created the original invoice with the $15,000 error. The timestamp was clear. Then, after I'd contacted her about it, she'd created new emails. Not sent them, created them. She'd used some kind of template or editing tool to fabricate emails that looked like they'd come from me, complete with fake headers and timestamps that appeared to be from before our conversation. And here's where it gets absurd. The audit trail even showed her going back and editing the original invoice file to try to change the metadata, attempting to replace her name with mine as the creator. But the system tracked that too. Every attempt she'd made to cover her tracks, to frame me for her mistake, was documented with timestamps and revision histories. Margaret called Jennifer into the office immediately. My lawyer and I sat there while she confronted Jennifer with the evidence. Jennifer tried to deny it at first, said there must be some mistake with the system, but the evidence was overwhelming. She'd left a digital paper trail of her entire scheme to frame me. Then Jennifer started crying, said she'd panicked when I found the error, that she was already on thin ice with management for other performance issues, that she thought if she got ahead of it and blamed me first, she could save her job. She actually expected sympathy for that explanation. Margaret fired her on the spot: fraud, falsifying company records, filing a false complaint against a coworker. The list went on. Security escorted Jennifer out while she was still crying and trying to apologize. HR offered me back pay for the suspension period, plus a settlement to avoid any potential lawsuit. My lawyer negotiated a higher settlement than they initially offered, enough to cover his fees and compensate me for the stress and damage to my reputation. They also put a formal letter in my file clearing me of all allegations and documenting exactly what had happened. I went back to work the following week. Everyone had heard what happened. Jennifer's dramatic firing had been the talk of the office. People were supportive, said they couldn't believe she'd done that, but there was still this awkwardness. The knowledge that someone had tried to destroy my career hung in the air. What happened next? Nobody saw it coming. About a month later, I started getting calls from recruiters asking for references for Jennifer. She was applying for other accounting positions in the area, and apparently she'd listed me as a reference. The audacity of that alone was staggering. But I decided to be honest. Every single recruiter who called, I told them the truth. I explained that Jennifer had been fired for fraud and falsifying records. I explained that she'd fabricated evidence to frame a coworker for her own mistake. I was careful to stick to facts, things that were documented and provable, nothing that could be considered defamatory. Word travels fast in our industry. It's a smaller community than people realize, and accountants talk. Jennifer's name became known, not for her skills or her experience, but for what she'd tried to do to me. I heard through mutual connections that she struggled to find work in accounting after that. Some companies wouldn't even interview her once they did a basic background check and found out about the termination. Others would get to the reference stage and hear the story. She eventually moved to a different city, and I lost track of her, but I know her career in our area was effectively over. Part of me felt bad about that. Part of me wondered if I should have been more forgiving, given her a neutral reference instead of an honest one. But then I'd remember sitting in that HR office, suspended without pay, terrified that I was going to lose everything because she'd lied. I'd remember the doctored emails with my name on them, and I'd remember that she'd done all of that, not because I'd wronged her, but because I'd tried to help her fix a mistake. She made a $15,000 error and then tried to ruin someone's entire career to avoid taking responsibility. That's not a momentary lapse in judgment, that's calculated malice. My career recovered. I got promoted about a year later actually, partly because of how I'd handled the situation. Management respected that I'd kept documentation, that I'd gotten a lawyer, that I'd protected myself professionally. It became a weird badge of credibility, but I never fully trusted coworkers the same way again. I document everything now, every conversation that matters, every correction I make, every time I help someone fix an error. I keep records because I learned the hard way that people will absolutely sacrifice you to save themselves. Jennifer taught me that some people see kindness as weakness and help as an opportunity to shift blame. Some workplace revenge is justified, but what about when corporate drama becomes a literal podcast about your downfall? I'd been fired 2 months earlier for what my boss called performance issues. The whole thing was a setup. I'd been doing good work, hitting my targets, getting positive feedback from clients, but my boss, Daniel, had his own agenda. He wanted to bring in someone from his old company, someone he'd worked with before, and I was in the way. So he manufactured a performance problem, documented a bunch of complaints that never actually happened, and pushed me out. I knew it was unfair, but I also knew fighting it would be expensive and exhausting. I took the severance package they offered, signed the NDA, and started looking for new opportunities. It stung, but I was ready to move on. Then a former colleague, someone I'd been pretty close with, sent me a message. Just a link with no context. The subject line said, "You need to hear this." It was a podcast. My old company had apparently started a leadership development podcast about 3 months after I left. Professional production, guest speakers, the whole corporate thought leadership thing. The episode my colleague sent me was titled, "When to Let Go of Underperforming Talent." I almost didn't listen. I didn't want to hear corporate speak about firing people, but something made me click play. Daniel's voice came through my speakers. He was being interviewed about tough decisions leaders have to make. And then he started telling a story about an employee he'd had to let go, an employee who he said had shown so much promise initially, but ultimately couldn't meet expectations. He described projects I'd worked on, used timelines that matched my tenure exactly, even repeated phrases from my actual termination meeting, word for word. He was talking about me on a public podcast to thousands of listeners, but that wasn't even the worst part. The way he described this employee, this version of me he was presenting to the world, was completely false. He said I was lazy, resistant to feedback, unable to work collaboratively. He claimed I'd missed multiple deadlines, that clients had complained about my work, that I'd been given numerous chances to improve and refused. None of it was true. I had documentation proving otherwise, performance reviews that praised my work, client emails thanking me for going above and beyond, project completion records showing I'd met every deadline. But Daniel was sitting on this podcast, broadcasting to my entire industry, painting me as incompetent. He talked about the difficult conversation he'd had to have with me, said I'd been defensive and unwilling to take responsibility, said letting me go was ultimately the kindest thing he could do because I clearly wasn't cut out for this kind of work. I listened to the whole episode twice, feeling sicker each time. This wasn't just unfair, this was defamation, and it was being distributed to everyone in my professional network. I checked the podcast analytics that were publicly available, thousands of downloads. The episode had been out for 2 weeks, and people I knew, people I'd worked with, clients I'd served, they'd all potentially heard this. I called an employment lawyer the next morning, explained the situation, sent her the podcast episode and my employment records. She listened to everything and then said this was actually a pretty clear-cut case. Daniel had violated the confidentiality clause in my severance agreement by discussing the circumstances of my termination publicly. And beyond that, if what he was saying was demonstrably false, which my documentation suggested it was, this was defamation. She drafted a cease and desist letter. It was detailed and aggressive, citing specific false statements from the podcast, referencing my evidence that contradicted his claims, and making it very clear that we were prepared to file a lawsuit for defamation and breach of contract. We sent it to the company's legal department and Daniel directly. The response was immediate. The company deleted the episode within hours, pulled it from every platform, removed it from the website, tried to scrub it from the internet entirely. Too late, obviously. People had already downloaded it. I had copies saved. The damage was done. Their lawyer called my lawyer the next day wanting to talk settlement. They were panicking. The NDA I'd signed had a confidentiality clause that went both ways. They weren't supposed to discuss my employment or termination publicly either. Daniel had violated it spectacularly, and they knew it. And here's where it gets absurd. The company's initial settlement offer was insulting. Basically, they'd give me a small amount of money to make this go away and promise not to mention me again. My lawyer laughed when she read it to me. We countered with our demands, 6 figures, a formal written apology, a positive reference letter that I could use for future job searches, and Daniel had to record a retraction. They tried to negotiate down. We held firm. My lawyer pointed out that a defamation lawsuit would be public, embarrassing, and expensive for them. Discovery would be brutal. We had the evidence. We had their own podcast as proof of violation. They didn't have a leg to stand on. They settled. Full amount, everything we asked for. The apology was carefully worded by their lawyers, but it was there, in writing, admitting that the podcast episode contained inaccurate characterizations and that my work had actually met company standards. The reference letter praised my contributions and said I'd left on good terms. Complete fiction, but useful fiction. Daniel never personally apologized. The retraction came from the company, not from him. I heard through the grapevine that he was furious about the settlement, that he felt the company had thrown him under the bus, which was rich, considering he'd thrown me under the bus first, then backed up and ran me over again on a public podcast. I used the settlement money to start my own consulting firm, took everything I'd learned in my years of corporate work and packaged it into services I could offer independently. Built a website, reached out to my network, started taking clients. My first major client was my old company's biggest competitor. I didn't seek them out specifically, but when they approached me, I definitely didn't say no. I helped them develop strategies that directly competed with initiatives I knew my old company was working on. Completely legal, completely ethical, and extremely satisfying. The consulting firm has been successful beyond what I expected. Turns out, getting publicly defamed and then winning a settlement creates a certain kind of reputation. People in the industry knew what had happened. The podcast episode had circulated before it was deleted. My name got associated with someone who'd been wronged and then fought back successfully. I still have colleagues from my old company reaching out occasionally, asking if I'm hiring. Apparently, Daniel's management style hasn't improved. People are leaving regularly. The company's reputation has taken hits, and every time someone asks me about what happened, I tell them the truth. Not the podcast version, the real version. Defaming a former employee on your corporate podcast and then being shocked when it violates your own NDA is truly inspired leadership. While we're on the topic of workplace nightmares, imagine getting transferred to a department run by someone who already hates you. I dated Chris in my mid-20s. It was one of those relationships that felt serious at the time, the kind where you start talking about futures and making long-term plans. We were together for 2 years before I found out he was cheating. Not a one-time mistake, a full-blown months-long affair with someone from his gym. I left immediately, blocked him on everything, and spent about a year rebuilding my life and my ability to trust people. A decade passed. I'd moved on completely, built a successful career in tech, dated other people, become a completely different version of myself. Chris was a closed chapter, something I occasionally thought about when old photos popped up on my timeline, but nothing that affected my daily life. Then my company went through a massive restructuring. Departments merged, teams reorganized, people got shuffled around. I was transferred from product development to a new innovation division. New role, new team, new projects. I was actually excited about it. Fresh start, chance to work on some cutting-edge stuff. My first day in the new department, I showed up for the team meeting. And there she was, Vanessa, my new director. Chris's wife. I recognized her from social media. I'd never actually met her, but I'd seen her in photos years ago when mutual friends posted about Chris's wedding. I'd felt nothing at the time except a vague sense of relief that I'd dodged a bullet. Now she was my boss. She recognized me too. I could see it in her face the moment I walked into the conference room. Her expression shifted slightly. A flash of something I couldn't quite read, but she stayed professional during the meeting, introduced me to the team, went through the agenda like normal. Our first one-on-one meeting happened 2 days later. I walked into her office and she closed the door behind me. Then she said very directly, "I know who you are. Chris told me everything about your relationship." My stomach tightened. I had no idea what version of our breakup Chris had told her, but I was willing to bet it wasn't the truthful one. I kept my voice calm. "I'm not sure what he told you, but just to be clear, I left him because he cheated on me. I found out about an affair and I ended things. That was 10 years ago and I haven't spoken to him since." Vanessa looked surprised, actually surprised, like this was new information. She studied my face for a moment. then nodded slowly. Okay, well, that's in the past. We're both professionals. I think we can keep things civil and focus on the work. I agreed, thanked her for being direct, left her office thinking maybe this would actually be fine. We were adults. A decade had passed. Surely we could work together without letting ancient history interfere. For 2 months, it was fine. Vanessa was a competent manager. I did good work. The team functioned well. We didn't socialize, but we didn't need to. Everything was professional and productive. Then I got assigned to a high visibility project, a major client partnership that could significantly impact the company's direction. It was exactly the kind of work I'd been hoping to do in this new role. I was thrilled, and here's where it gets absurd. Vanessa started micromanaging every aspect of my work on the project. Every email I sent had to be approved by her first. Every document I created had to go through 3 rounds of her review. Every meeting I attended, she insisted on being there too, often speaking over me or contradicting my suggestions in front of clients. My work, which had been consistently praised in my previous department, was suddenly never good enough. She'd reject deliverables without clear explanation, just vague comments about them not meeting standards or needing more strategic thinking. I'd revise based on her feedback, and she'd reject again with completely different criticisms. Other team members started getting pulled into my meetings without me being told. I'd show up to a client call and find out Vanessa had added 3 other people to the invite and positioned them as leads on aspects I'd been handling. My responsibilities got quietly reassigned while I was kept on the project in name only. I tried talking to her directly, asked if there were specific concerns about my work, if there was something I needed to improve. She said everything was fine, that she just had high standards for this particular client. But the pattern continued. Then came the breaking point. I got excluded from a critical project meeting entirely, a meeting about the project I was supposedly leading. I only found out about it because a colleague mentioned it in passing and seemed confused that I hadn't been there. When I checked my calendar, there was no invite. When I asked Vanessa about it, she said it must have been an administrative error. I started documenting everything, every rejected deliverable, every meeting I was excluded from, every time she contradicted me in front of clients, every reassignment of my responsibilities. I kept a detailed log with dates, times, and specific examples. After 3 months of this, I requested a transfer back to my original department. I couldn't work under these conditions anymore. My mental health was suffering, my confidence was shot, and I knew this had nothing to do with my actual performance and everything to do with whatever Vanessa had decided about me. HR scheduled an exit interview to discuss my transfer request. I brought my documentation, showed them the pattern of behavior, the timeline of when it started, the contrast between my work in my previous role and how I was being treated now. The HR rep's expression changed as she went through my examples. She asked if I knew why Vanessa might be treating me differently than other team members. I explained the history, that I'd dated her husband a decade ago, that the relationship had ended badly, that I'd been transparent about it with Vanessa, but maybe that hadn't been enough. HR said they'd look into it. I didn't expect much. These things rarely go anywhere, especially when it's your word against a director's. But then what happened next? Nobody saw it coming. HR launched a full investigation. They interviewed other team members, reviewed Vanessa's management history, looked at performance patterns across her entire tenure at the company, and they found something. I wasn't the first woman Vanessa had targeted. There was a pattern going back almost 2 years. Any woman she perceived as attractive or threatening in some way got the same treatment I'd been experiencing. Micromanagement, exclusion, nitpicking, gradual removal from high visibility work. Several women had quietly transferred out of her department. One had left the company entirely. It wasn't about me and Chris specifically. It was about Vanessa's own insecurity and her willingness to sabotage other women's careers because of it. The investigation took about a month. Vanessa was demoted, not fired, which honestly surprised me, but moved to a position with no direct reports and significantly less authority. They offered to let me stay in the innovation department under new leadership, or transfer to my original department with a promotion. I took the promotion and went back. I didn't want to stay in a department that would always be associated with that nightmare experience. I heard through the office grapevine about 6 months later that Vanessa and Chris were getting divorced. Apparently his cheating had never stopped. The affair he'd had while we were dating wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, and Vanessa had finally had enough. Part of me felt vindicated. The man she'd resented me for dating, the man whose history with me had apparently triggered all her insecurities, had been betraying her the entire time. But mostly I just felt sad for her. Sad that she'd wasted years with someone who didn't respect her. Sad that she'd let her insecurities drive her to damage other women's careers. Sad that she'd probably never realize how much of her pain was self-inflicted. I stayed at the company for another year before moving on to a better opportunity elsewhere. Vanessa and I never spoke again after the investigation. I have no idea where she ended up, and I don't particularly care. Sabotaging your subordinates because your husband cheated on his ex with you a decade ago is certainly a choice, just not a good one. But revenge doesn't always require corporate channels. Sometimes it's best served through your own creativity. Maya and I had been best friends since we were 12 years old. 15 years of sleepovers, inside jokes, shared secrets, and unconditional support. She knew everything about me, the things I'd never tell my family, the experiences I was ashamed of, the trauma I was still processing. I trusted her with all of it because that's what best friends do. They hold your darkest moments and help you carry them. When Maya told me she was trying stand-up comedy, I was thrilled for her. She'd always been funny, quick with a comeback, the kind of person who could make a room laugh without trying. She started doing open mics at local clubs, building material, working on her stage presence. I went to her early shows, cheered her on, gave her feedback. I was genuinely proud to watch her pursue something she loved. Her comedy got better. She started getting booked at real venues, not just open mics. People were noticing her. She'd text me after shows, excited about how well a bit had landed, how the audience had responded. I celebrated every success with her because I thought we were building this together. Her pursuing her dream and me being her biggest supporter. Then someone I vaguely knew from college sent me a video. It was a clip from one of Maya's recent sets posted on the club's social media. The message just said, "Isn't this your story?" I watched the video and felt my stomach turn. Maya was on stage, holding the microphone, telling a story about her friend's eating disorder. She described the hospital visits, the family interventions, the relapse that happened during finals week of sophomore year. She'd changed small details, different college, different major, but every significant element was mine, my eating disorder, my recovery, my private hell that I'd shared with her in confidence. The audience was laughing. She'd structured it as comedy, found the absurd moments, delivered it with perfect timing. And people were eating it up. I kept watching her social media, her posted sets, recordings people had shared. There were more. A bit about a friend whose dad had an affair that destroyed her family. That was my dad, my family. My trauma from watching my parents' marriage implode when I was 16. Another bit about consoling a friend after a sexual assault. My assault. The one I'd barely been able to talk about. The one I was still in therapy processing. She'd taken my life, my pain, my most vulnerable moments, and turned them into her material. Changed just enough details to have plausible deniability, but not enough that anyone who knew me wouldn't recognize the stories. I felt violated in a way I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just gossip or breaking confidence. This was public performance. She was getting paid to tell my stories, building her career on my trauma. I called her immediately, tried to stay calm, but my voice was shaking. I told her I'd seen the clips, that I recognized my own stories in her material. Asked her what the hell she was thinking. Maya sounded defensive right away. All comedians use real life. That's how comedy works. You draw from your experiences and the people around you. These aren't your experiences, I said. They're mine. And you never asked if it was okay to share them publicly. She sighed like I was being difficult. You're being too sensitive. I changed details. No one knows it's about you specifically. I know, I said. And that matters. These are my stories to tell or not tell. You don't get to profit off my pain without permission. She told me I was overreacting, that I should be flattered my life was interesting enough to be material, that this was just part of being friends with a comedian. Then she said she had to go. She was late for a meeting, and we hung up, but that wasn't even the worst part. She didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, I saw more clips, the same stories refined and polished. She'd clearly been working on them, making them tighter, getting bigger laughs. My eating disorder became a running bit. My assault became a closer that killed every time. I warned her again. sent her a text saying if she didn't remove those stories from her material, there would be consequences. She left me on red, so I bought a ticket to her next big show. It was at a decent-sized club, a showcase where she was one of the headliners, the kind of show that could lead to bigger opportunities. Industry people would be there, other comedians, potential agents. I sat in the back and watched her set. She performed the eating disorder bit, got huge laughs, moved into the affair story. People were loving it. Then she started setting up the assault story, her big closer. The show had a Q&A section after the performances. Audience members could ask the comedians questions, get advice, interact. Maya was on stage with two other comics, glowing from the success of her set. I raised my hand. The host pointed to me and handed me the microphone. This is where patience finally snapped. I stood up so everyone could see me. "Hey Maya," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Remember that story you tell about your friend's eating disorder? And the one about the sexual assault? I'm that friend. And I never gave you permission to profit off my pain." The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Every eye in the club turned to Maya, her face drained of all color. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I kept going. "Those aren't your stories to tell. That's my trauma, my recovery, my life. And you turned it into a punchline without ever asking if that was okay." Someone in the audience said something, then someone else. Within seconds, people were talking, murmuring, some getting loud. A few people started booing. Not me, Maya. The club owner came on stage and quietly asked Maya to step backstage. She left without saying anything, just walked off while the audience's reaction grew louder. I gave the microphone back and left through the back exit. My hands were shaking, but I felt clear-headed. I'd said what I needed to say. The fallout was immediate. People who'd been at the show posted about it online. The clip of my call-out circulated on comedy forums and social media. Other comedians weighed in, most of them criticizing Maya for using someone's trauma without consent. Several venues cancelled her upcoming shows. A showcase she'd been invited to perform at dropped her from the lineup. Maya tried to do damage control, posted an apology on her social media saying she'd made a mistake and was learning and growing, but it rang hollow. She'd had multiple chances to stop and had chosen her career over my privacy every single time. She called me crying a week later, said she was sorry that she'd fucked up, that she understood now why I was upset, asked if there was any way we could fix this. I told her that some betrayals don't get fixed, that she'd made a choice when she decided my worst moments were worth a laugh, that I hope her comedy career was worth 15 years of friendship, because that's what she'd traded it for. Things went from bad to unhinged when she posted a longer statement, calling me vindictive and saying I'd ruined her life over a misunderstanding, that I couldn't handle the nature of comedy and had weaponized cancel culture against her. That's when other people she'd mined for material started coming forward. Turns out I wasn't the only one. She'd been using stories from multiple friends, family members, people who trusted her. The pattern became undeniable. Her comedy career effectively ended, not because of me specifically, but because she'd built it on a foundation of violated trust and stolen stories. When that foundation crumbled, there was nothing left. Do I regret what I did? Not even a little. Maya had every opportunity to respect my boundaries, to apologize, to remove the material. She chose not to. She chose her career over my consent, her success over my privacy. Some people said I should have handled it privately, that calling her out publicly was too harsh. But she'd made my trauma public without permission. She'd performed it on stages for strangers. All I did was reclaim the narrative and tell the truth. Turning your best friend's sexual assault into your signature closing bit, and then being shocked when she objects, is a special kind of delusional. If you've made it this far into the chaos, you've witnessed betrayals in every corner of life. Work, love, family, and everything in between. These stories remind us that trust is fragile, boundaries matter, and sometimes the people closest to us are capable of the most unexpected cruelty. But they also show us something else: resilience. Every person in these stories found a way to stand up, speak out, and reclaim their power, even when the world felt like it was collapsing. Sweet dreams, everyone, and remember, keep your secrets close, your receipts closer, and never underestimate the power of standing up for yourself. If today's stories taught us anything, It's that the truth always finds a way to surface, and sometimes karma doesn't need any help from us at all. Until next time, stay safe, stay skeptical, and keep those boundaries strong.